As was said on the prior panel, my name is Michael Lucchese. I'm a communications consultant and an editor at Law and Liberty and Providence magazine, and I'm joined by two distinguished panelists. So first, Robert Emmett Moffit is a senior fellow in health and welfare policy at the Heritage Foundation and former chairman of the Maryland Healthcare Commission. Previously, he was senior official in the Reagan administration and has testified frequently before Congress. He has published in professional and specialty journals, including the Harvard Health Policy Review, Health Affairs, and the Journal of Law and Health Policy. His essays on Orestes Brownson have appeared in the Catholic Historical Review, Modern Age, the Political Science Reviewer, and Perspectives on Political Science. And then Elliot Bartky is Emeritus Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Purdue University, Fort Wayne, where he taught for 30 years. He also taught for 20 years at the University of Notre Dame as an adjunct associate professor in the program of liberal studies. Bartky's publications include articles and essays on religion and politics, American political thought, ancient political thought, Marx, and Jewish political thought. He has been published in American Political Thought, the Review of Politics, and other professional outlets. So my panelists will be discussing Orestes Brownson and post-Civil War constitutionalism. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here this morning to talk about one of America's greatest contributors to American political thought and a great and true patriot. The topic that I'm going to address is democracy. You may recall H.L. Mencken, the irrepressible editor of the Baltimore Sun, once said that democracy is the theory that the common good, that the common people know what is good for them, and they get it, good and hard. And if you listen or you read some of Orestes Brownson's journalistic comments during his career, he sounds very, very much like H.L. Mencken. I'm going to make an argument, however, that Orestes Augustus Brownson was, in fact, a true champion of American democracy. As I said, some of his comments to the contrary suggest something quite different. One of them, I'm going to read one comment here from The Convert in 1857, and it's referring to something, it's referring to the 1840 campaign that was referenced earlier, where Martin Van Buren said basically Brownson cost him the White House. But he writes in that, he says, quote, "The electioneering campaign of 1840, carried on by doggerels, log cabins, hard cider, means utterly corrupt and corrupting, disgusted me with democracy as distinguished from constitutional republicanism, destroyed what little confidence I had in popular elections, and made me distrust both the intelligence and the instincts of the masses." Well, anyway, in 1840, Brownson was a militant partisan Democrat. And as you know, he probably was one of the top men of the far left at that period. But his naive vision of the rational voter, weighing the alternatives after careful deliberation on the personalities running for office and the policies presented to the folks, and judging the respective merits of competing policies, was shattered forever. 2 years later, he wrote, "There is, quote, all too much fulsome flattery of the people, too much nonsense uttered about independent voters." So he had lost his democratic faith, it appeared. He referred to the alleged intelligence of the people as, quote, all humbug. Well, anyway, because of these and similar remarks, some of our colleagues in academia, leading academics, classified Brownson as an opponent of democratic government. And I'll just mention, there's several of them, but I'll just mention some of the big guys. You all remember from studying the Constitution, Charles and Mary Beard. Charles Beard said that Brownson's hostility to the abusive behavior of demagogues did not warrant his total condemnation of democracy. David Hackett Fisher up at Brandeis University classified Orestes Brownson along with Henry David Thoreau as an anti-democrat. Professor Lewis Hartz is the author of a great book called The Liberal Tradition in America. He lamented Brownson's retreat from liberalism, and he said that should not have resulted in his headlong flight from the principle of democracy. Well, in any event, I'm here to tell you this morning that Brownson's leading academic critics are simply flat out wrong. Brownson made a lot of comments in journalism where he's writing under deadlines. And his journalistic commentaries, sometimes they overshadow what in fact is a far more sophisticated complexity of his political theory, especially as it developed from his middle to his mature years. I want you to consider the evidence, which is his own language. 3 years after that big failure in 1840, where Van Buren was defeated, he reaffirmed his basic devotion to the democratic cause, and I think it's worthy of a quote. Quote, we have lost no confidence in nor love for popular institutions. The struggle for democratic forms of government has been too long and too severe, has enlisted too many of the wise and the good, has been consecrated by too many prayers and sufferings and sacrifices to permit us, even if our confidence of ultimate success were altogether less than it really is, to think even for 1 minute of ceasing to continue our devotion to it. Let's clear this up. There's a lot of confusion, especially today in our political rhetoric, over the meaning of democracy. It is routinely, in today's politics, partisan Democrats often routinely accuse the president of being anti-democratic, while insisting incorrectly that the American founding fathers established a, quote, democracy. So let's clarify this. Democracy is not an end. It is a means. In Aristotle's terminology, the decision-making process of government is a decision-making process of the many in a democracy, as opposed to the one or the few. So the democratic system is logically coextensive with 3 operational principles. First is popular sovereignty, meaning that the supreme power of the state rests in the collective people. Secondly, political equality. One person's vote is not to count more than another person's vote as a citizen. And majority rule, the principle that the majority should make all of the final decisions. For the record, throughout his career, and a close reading of his political theory shows that Brownson never deviated from any of these principles. Take popular sovereignty. The democratic concept of popular sovereignty, again, is that the authority to make decisions binding on a community is to be located in the membership of the community and located in those persons as a group over whom the authority is to be exercised. For reasons of practicality, direct democracy cannot exist except at the local level or among a small group of people. Moreover, the founders of the American Republic, I hasten to add, were not Democrats in the well-understood meaning of that term at the time that they were drafting the Constitution. They were really classical liberals, and their primary concern was the protection of natural rights and the preservation of personal liberty. And with the federal Constitution, the Charter of American Government that they crafted in Philadelphia, they created what the ancients referred to, Aristotle in particular, and Polybius, as a mixed regime. As Professor Martin Diamond at the University of Chicago has pointed out, however, it is nevertheless true that the founders created the most democratic constitution that existed up to that time. The issue of the question of Brownson's commitment to democracy, but what about direct democracy? Did Brownson ever actually accept the idea of the people getting together and actually governing themselves directly? And the answer is yes. The answer is yes. Under the constitutional order, the division between the power of the federal government and the power of the states. Within the states, you had local governments, and he saw New England township government, which was in fact democratic, simple democratic government, as actually one of the models of democratic government. And I'll quote, "In what are called the New England states, the best governed portion of the Union, each town is a corporation and having important powers and the charge of all purely local matters, chooses its own officers, manages its own finances, takes charge of its own poor, of its roads and bridges, and of the education of its children." So it's pretty clear. Now, what about the principle of political equality? As I said, the principle of political equality holds that in arriving at a group decision, each member accounts for one and no more than one in the decision-making process. The Democrats' denial of elitism is based on the assumption that in any given community, there is no one within himself or by virtue of any special knowledge or skill or any kind of superior or inherent right over and above that of his fellows to exercise political authority over the entire community. Brownson, in the American Republic, explicitly favors universal suffrage in the sense in which it is generally understood in the 19th century as applicable to full male suffrage among men. If this makes him a member of the democratic movement in the context of those times, well, then he was unquestionably a Democrat. On the issue of suffrage for the newly liberated black slaves, Brownson was very clear. He was sympathetic to the concerns that the newly liberated black slaves were ignorant, they were illiterate, they had very, very little political experience. He was not unsympathetic to that concern, but he did not agree with those concerns and favored the inclusion of the newly liberated black Americans in the political process. In a private letter to Congressman William Kelly of New Jersey on December 24th, 1865, he wrote, quote, "I'm in favor of the Negro suffrage, but I want it constitutionally introduced. I think that the American idea excludes all political distinctions based on birth, property, or complexion." What he said privately, he repeated publicly in the American Republic that same year. Resistance to black suffrage, he insisted, quote, "cannot long stand before the onward progress of American democracy, which asserts equal majority rights, equal rights for all, and not for a race or a class only." For Brownson, as Professor Duncan pointed out, the main threat to political equality came from two distinct but allied forces. One was the financial aristocracy of America's industrial capitalists and also the masters of party organizations. So in any event, it was very, very clear that he was a supporter of political equality, but he also saw it constantly threatened by corporate interests. On the question of majority rule, a logical consequence of the acceptance of popular sovereignty and political equality is the acceptance of majority rule. By the very fact that politics presupposes a peaceful disagreement over specific measures or general policy, unanimity, of course, is impossible. Minority rule, the exercise of authority by a smaller part of the community, is logically incompatible with both popular sovereignty and political equality. If one cannot or does not accept unanimity of the political community or minority rule, the only logical alternative is the exercise of political authority in majority rule. Needless to say, Brownson was never an elitist. It has been mentioned earlier about John Locke and Locke's contract theory of government, that political authority is ultimately rooted in personal consent. It is one of Brownson's major points of disagreement with many of his colleagues at the time. if the state is no more than a voluntary association, the free act of its members, kind of like a bridge club, it's logically dependent on the particular consent of the members for its very existence. That consent is necessary logically, and in order for the state to operate authoritatively at all. The state's fictional sovereignty then is fictional. It is the sum of individual sovereignties that compose it. And surely under this arrangement, any two or three persons, anytime they deemed it pleasant or convenient or necessary to do so, could legitimately erect a state. Living within a state not to their liking, there's no reason why they couldn't simply secede from its jurisdiction, establish themselves in some unoccupied stretch of territory and set up their own. If there is a right of popular self-determination, surely, given this atomistic conception of the social order, there can be no logical objection to personal self-determination. If the state becomes an extension of personal will, that's fine, theoretically, but this is not the beginning. It is, in fact, the end of civil society. This is significant when you take the Lockean doctrine and apply it to the several states. If the several states are indeed individually sovereign, as Calhoun argued, Calhoun, by the way, did not propose secession, but if the states are individually sovereign, the Union is nothing more than a group of sovereigns. If a state can freely join the Union as the sovereign, as the supreme power, then there's nothing logically objectionable about a state deciding to leave the Union. So the point is that the Lockean doctrine is sound as far as it goes, talking about natural law, natural rights, life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, and so on. But it does not provide a legitimate ground for political authority. And Brownson's argument is very important here. It logically cannot. It cannot provide a stable ground for political authority. So when Brownson speaks disparagingly sometimes about democracy, you have to read closely about what he's talking about and what he's saying. The thing that he does concern him is the growth of what he calls mass democracy or humanitarian democracy. That is his central concern. The humanitarian democracy or the mass democracy, he points out in the American Republic and in other writings, is fueled by a passion for social and economic leveling, radical egalitarianism. He also points out that the moral fervor fueling the crusade for social leveling, the salvation of society, and is basically, in his view, a secular variant of the stern and religious tradition of the Calvinists. And there is no limit to where they will go. New rules, new regulations, no matter how minuscule, they're not beyond the pretensions of the guardians of social goodness. Social goodness will be enforced, and if that requires a leveling of social and economic life, that's the way it will be. A moral intensity is what characterizes it, with folks who are passionate about setting right all the messy spots, loose ends of the world. This is, in his view, one of the threats that emerged after the Civil War, and he points out that this ultimately will lead to political absolutism because there is no limitation. This belief in absolute majoritarianism was not a straw man. We were talking about this earlier privately, but this idea that, the majority rule, might makes right, that sounds absurd. Who could possibly believe that? But Brownson points out that J.L. O'Sullivan, his editor of the Democratic Review, had clearly expressed his belief in the rightness of unchecked and absolute rule of the government of the majority. Brownson was, as you all know, an intellectual leader of the Jacksonian era. He was quite clear about his personal disagreements with his fellow Democrats. So there is a vitally important point here. He recognized that this humanitarian democracy of the post-Civil War era, he recognized that it was at war fundamentally with the Constitution. But it was more so a new variant of political absolutism. Its rhetoric was the rhetoric of humane and popular government, but Brownson had become a prescient critic of the modern phenomenon that J.L. Talman, a great political scientist, later referred to as totalitarian democracy, the threat of the tyranny of the majority. That was a concern of the Founding Fathers, but it was an even greater concern for Orestes Brownson, and there's a reason for that. The reason is the threat was coupled by an increasing secularization of political and social life, the loss of a common moral language, and increasingly with secularization, the substitution of the state for God. So he saw in its embryonic stage the emergence of the modern absolute state, the kind of totalitarian state that was realized later on in the 20th century in communist Russia and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. He knew that the absolute state could emerge not just from autocracy or oligarchy, but it could just as easily arrive through an absolutist democracy, mass democracy. Brownson determined that American sovereignty, the supreme power of the American Republic, was located in the people of the United States, but, as Professor Duncan pointed out, not as an undifferentiated mass, but as the people in the states united. The American Republic was a national state, born in war and revolution, and it occupied a national territory, and the sovereign people defined and occupied that territory, and the United States existed as a national people within an order of states. No state occupied territory that was not equally the territory of the United States, and therefore no state, by an act of secession, could rightfully or legitimately dispossess the United States of its own national territory. Brownson never deviated from the argument that elitism has no business in American government. There is no superior ethical right to exercise political authority by an elite. No elite, whether it's a business elite or an elite blessed with some kind of special knowledge or expertise, could claim any prior rights over the simple folk in the business of actually governing America. Brownson never deviated from this line of thought, even though he suggested, of course, that America would benefit, like every other nation, from very talented first families. All of his life, he remained a determined and consistent opponent of political privilege, whether predicated upon race or property or class. He remained throughout his entire life a champion of the idea that the people, authorizing and living under the federal Constitution that they formally established in the Convention of 1787, are sovereign, that all men as voting citizens were equal to all other men, that the vote was not a birthright, but rather a sacred public trust to be granted by the sovereign, and that the government should always be understood as an agency for the security of the common good and never an agency for the advancement of personal or private interests. Thank you.
So what I'm going to talk about is democracy.
It's him.
Yeah. Okay. Is democracy after the Civil War, and focus a little bit on why Orestes Brownson was horrifically, for some people. I've been told by some important political theorists they didn't want to hear about him anymore because he opposed the 14th Amendment. And I'll talk about that a little, but what I really want to do here is to try to make clear his political philosophy. And I don't really do it to understand Orestes Brownson, but the question was raised before about integralists and others, Catholic thinkers, who may really be outside of the tradition. And I think that Orestes Brownson offers a more Catholic, I'm not Catholic, you probably figured that out, a Catholic in both, when I taught at Notre Dame, I used to say, you can't call this a Catholic university because universal university doesn't make sense. It's repetitive. But it's a Catholic, big C, small c, universal, universe. So what is that? We have a lot to learn from Orestes Brownson's approach to thinking about democracy during and after the Civil War, and his method for understanding democracy in particular and politics in general draws from the wisdom of the past and speaks to the crisis of our times and provides, I think, a means for navigating future political currents. All three things. I want to suggest that Orestes Brownson's approach to politics, I want to call it a political theological question, and it's the foundation for understanding pretty much everything he does in his mature writings. But to clarify what I mean by political theological question, which he's really obsessed with, I want to say, first of all, what it's not. And there's a lot of confusion about the relationship between religion and politics, and people talking about the relationship in different ways that I think needs to be clarified. So one thing, the political theological question cannot be reduced to a question of religion, politics, or church-state relations. One might argue for a complete separation of church and state and insist that religion provides a necessary moral foundation of political order, or you can argue that the state should be subordinate to the church. So a complete separation, religion serves the state as a moral foundation, or the church should be superior to the state. The first point denies religion any place in the public square. The second sees religion as a handmaid to political order, and the third maybe have underlying theological presumptions, but settles the question of the relationship between the city of man and the city of God in a manner failing to comprehend both our human and divine natures. I'm tempted to say that all three approaches, however much may claim to have ancient and medieval antecedents, owe more to Hobbes than their ancient or medieval predecessors. Brownson's political theological approach draws upon biblical wisdom as well as the wisdom of Plato and Aristotle. And one of the things that one should really do if they want to suffer is read. There's a series of articles written by Brownson on synthetic philosophy, 3 on synthetic philosophy, and 3 on the origins of government. And after the 1840 election, when he's rethinking everything, he went back and studied very deeply Plato and Aristotle, and that's what pushed him to become a member of the church. It's very critical for understanding that. So although the Greek philosophers don't recognize God as the first principle, Plato and Aristotle do recognize universal justice or nature, such that all regimes could only be, at best, a reflection of a higher ideal. Only the biblical tradition, or what Brownson referred to as the Catholic truth, big C, recognized God as the first principle, that God, the creator, stood outside of nature, and that God was a universal God standing in judgment above all nations. The Bible was the first to reject the pagan idea of the unity of religion and politics, and the first to recognize a common humanity such that no person, people, or nation had the right to enslave or destroy another. Yet Brownson agreed with Plato and Aristotle, believing that the city, and this is critical, mediated between the human and the divine realms. And a lot of that, it's because, and Bob says in his paper, there's no specifically Catholic favorite for this regime or that regime. Well, what Brownson is doing is going back to the ancients, as well as his biblical faith, to fashion a way of approaching the role of politics as mediating between, without substituting the state, of course, for Christ. That's always the true mediator. But the state has a very important role to play. And political scientists and historians of the founding era may not be too concerned with the substance of theological questions such as the nature of God, the nature of man, sin and redemption, or philosophical questions on the nature of liberty, equality, or law and justice. But Brownson recognized that the answers to these questions, or thinking that were essential for understanding politics. And if you don't take that, it's not just that Brownson says it's a providential republic, or, the divine has to play a role in all this, because there are people often, will say, I believe in God. So what? What does God want from you? What does God want you to do? What does God expect from us? And what can we do to serve God? And that for Brownson is really critical. And in fact, leads him to, on the one hand, praise the providential founding of America, but to recognize serious problems with various types of Protestant thought in fashioning a political order. So Brownson, while he draws on the biblical and the Greek traditions, also, as Bob and others have pointed out, did not reject the ideas of Locke entirely, or the founders. And this is going to become very important in a few minutes, but for Brownson, the founders were incoherent on their philosophical principles. So even if we say, well, that they fashioned a constitution better than they understood, which he does say, and they pointed to a higher order, but they're incoherent on it. One of the things, for example, I remember reading as a graduate student a letter of Jefferson to a friend, and he says, if you want to understand the Jewish people, you can't just read their Old Testament. You have to read their Mishnah, the Gemara, the Talmud. And he starts listing all these Jewish texts. And I'm like, wow, he knew about it? And he says, and once you do that, you realize what a low and degraded people they are, only fit for slavery. So, but it makes sense from his liberal perspective. That is, a people who are based on law as the intermediary between us, the Jewish people, and God. It's slavery coming from above. It's mental slavery. So I don't want to dwell on that at all, but it's important to understand Brownson's approach to these political theological questions, because the Constitution, has been said repeatedly, is really the written and the unwritten Constitution. And I'm not going to go into, I left this part in, but I'm going to skip over it. In those essays on synthetic and philosophy and the origin of government, he argues that natural law does not answer the question concerning the best possible regime. It only insists that government is not merely of human convention, and that natural law establishes the terms for understanding the role of politics in the relationship between the human and the divine. The distinction between religion and politics, which Christianity introduced into political thought when it presented Christ as the Redeemer, as the intermediary between the human and the divine realms, neither legitimizes all political authority nor withdraws a Christian from political life. Government, Brownson argues, does not originate in spontaneity alone, nor in the outward ordinance of God alone, but it must respond to man's nature, to an inherent and essential want of humanity. The essential want of humanity includes both the lower and higher aspects of our nature. Political life, then, is, for Brownson, a fundamental fact of the human condition, and liberty is essential for establishing a government to mediate between our lower and higher nature. So, in other words, to admit the place of natural law is to insist on humanity's political nature, and that nature is intimately connected to the divine. Again, natural law does not recognize any particular political regime as the best regime, Rather, it insists that the founding and maintenance of any regime must attend to both human convention and our divine nature. So natural law allows for a diversity of regimes. And so to say that the American regime, as he does, is the best regime for a particular reason, he doesn't think it should be put on anybody else. Because as Bob and others said, the idea of a territorial democracy or providential regime not only includes the states or the local communities, but for that's very critical that the providential part includes our human nature, both our lower and our higher elements, which means family, the relationship between the husband and the wife, parents and children, friends, and it also includes work, leisure, time, place. So the importance of the small towns, that model of a small town, is because it teaches people something beyond their own self-interest, beyond their own ego. It teaches them about love or fraternity as the foundation of political community. And that's critical for Brownson. So for Brownson, then political life is a fundamental fact of the human condition. Again, liberty is essential in establishing a government to mediate between the lower and the higher realms. Now, why did Brownson then, if that's the background, oppose the 14th Amendment? And in the paper that I wrote with a colleague, I go into a great deal on the parts of the 14th Amendment and why he's opposed to it. But I think just what I should do now, because of time, is focus on his objection in the broad sense. And he opposed the amendment because he said it fundamentally altered the synthetic relationship between the particular and general government, and therefore undermined liberty. The amendment continued this trend of federal government dictating policy, which he clearly rejects. The grand, quote, the grand error of general government or the people in relation to it is in forgetting that it only created for general as distinguished from particular private interest, that is a government of express and limited powers, not a supreme national government with all the powers of government and not expressly denied by the Constitution. So, and he argues that the 14th Amendment will, number one, destroy the federal system, and that it was a result of the 14th Amendment. It's not going to help the freed Negroes. It's not going to help women. The only people that are going to benefit by the 14th Amendment are going to be the financial elites, which, if you think about the application of the 14th Amendment to the former slaves, African Americans, I mean, he's right for a long period of time. That's correct. I'm not agreeing with his rejection of the 14th Amendment, by the way. I'm just saying what his argument is to it. So it's going to homogenize the country, lead to the powers of the central government increasingly controlling our lives. And so he opposed it because what it does will eventually collapse the constitutional order. And if I can return for a moment back to my point about his political theological argument, that what he's saying is that, we have to maintain both a connection between the human realm and the divine realm, but we have to understand that there is a distinction as well. And political order, to serve its proper purpose in the larger order of things, has to maintain that which is most appropriate for both the political and spiritual aspects of the republic. So raise the question, how does Brownson's political theological approach to the American Constitution, what can we learn from that for discourse today? A few things in wrapping up. Again, politics is a mediator between the human and divine, so that the divine is always present, But we have, and this is critical, a limited ability to extract from divine wisdom certainty about political things. Therefore, we require prudence. Now, prudence doesn't mean just making choices that are best to get what you want. Prudence must always be informed by the higher order of things. It's political action directed towards that higher, but it requires choice. So while insisting upon the priority of the church, which he does, we must also attend to the nature of the regime. Natural law is a guide. It does not dictate all political matters, right, for Brownson. That's critical. So there was an essential relationship between a written and unwritten constitution, but for Brownson, there's also an essential tension, and you don't want to ignore that. Natural law, again, does not overcome or put an end to the fragility of human things. And again, there are different approaches to this. One, as I began the paper, there's a notion that we can completely separate religion from politics, and that's the solution. The Hobbesian solution in a strange way, perhaps. But also, it's just as foolish to suppose that there can be a complete harmony between religion, or between the Providential and the written Constitution. To pretend a harmony without the tension, that is to be blind to the dangers of liberalism. Because Brownson, while he's a defender of democracy, as Bob said, but he also understands, and he says this in an essay on the democratic principle, that the democratic principle, which is the principle of ego, it's a principle of passion, of our lower desires, that democratic principle can destroy the republic. And liberalism does feed that. I mean, Hamilton in Federalist 12 talks about enlightened statesmen everywhere understanding the importance of an active commerce, and then he praises the pursuit of gold and silver, those darling objects of human avarice. And he uses the word avarice, which is kind of a strange thing from a Christian perspective. It's not profit he's praising, it's avarice too. And he understands the danger of it too. But we don't want to confound or say anymore that there's a separation, that there is a complete harmony. The third thing is, despite the dangers of liberalism, the written Constitution and against this written Constitution to secure the maintenance of the republic, they are both, the written and unwritten, fundamental to America's political order. So that my friend Patrick Deneen, when he talks about the end of liberalism in America, it's just wrong. It's wrong. The problem isn't liberalism, it's democracy wrongly understood, as his own teacher would have told him if he was still alive. Liberalism can be a problem, but it's also a blessing. The problem, well, I can say it in this university and in this audience, is sin. That's the problem. And to the extent that there are elements in the republic that feed the sin and our greed, that's dangerous. But that's not liberalism in itself. So Brownson never made the mistake of confusing liberalism with personal or humanitarian democracy. The notion that liberalism is responsible for its own demise is to fail to understand that both our human and divine nature and the role of politics as an intermediary between the lower and the higher parts is critical. It's not a bad thing. And then, just as it is wrong to suppose that liberalism in the written Constitution can be done away with, is equally wrong to believe that religious teachings are essential, always essential anyway, to the moral foundation of the republic. So, for example, he's critical of Tocqueville. Tocqueville, like Brownson, talks about the importance of religion for maintenance of moral order. Lots of people do, but that means that religion is a handmaid to politics. You can't do that. So you can talk about providence, you can talk about the importance of religion, but really, what about the higher law? And he always wants to maintain that distinction. They can be friends It can be compatible, but one can't serve the other. And Brownson has no illusion that politics may be simply a handmaid to the church. And I guess this is addressing integralists of the various sorts. And this neither comprehends politics as an intermediary between human and divine, and the divine, but it's a very stunted view of both human and divine nature. And I dare say that it owes more to Hobbes in its own way than it does to Aquinas or to Plato or Aristotle. It's a lot more complicated. And so the final thing I want to say is that Brownson recognizes that all regimes decay and that the means to preserve the republic warrant an appropriate method for thinking, speaking, and educating citizens about the promise and problems of democracy. In that sense, I think if we look at that larger political philosophy of Brownson, it does address many of the heresies of our time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our panelists for their wonderful papers. We only have about 10 minutes left in this session, and I don't want to keep anyone from a lunch. So I thought I might just ask a couple of questions, and depending on how much time we might be able to open it up, but I'm sure that our panelists would be happy to answer any questions that you have during lunch. So Dr. Moffit, I'd like to start by asking you a question. Your paper does a really excellent job of clarifying the meaning of democracy in Bronson's thought more broadly, and demonstrating what about the American Constitution he admired. But of course, some of his anti-slavery contemporaries, I think especially of somebody like William Lloyd Garrison of The Liberator, for example, did not admire the Constitution at all. And they sort of argued that the Constitution was a betrayal of the Declaration of Independence's principle. And lots of people down through American history have repeated this criticism on the left and the right alike. So I wanted to ask you specifically, how did Brownson view the Declaration as a part of America's constitutional tradition?
The Declaration of Independence was, for Brownson, an affirmation of a fundamental truth. The fundamental truth was the United States declared war on Great Britain as a single nation. And with the Declaration of Independence, what you have is an affirmation. Of course, there's a lot of things there, including, as Garrison points out, the natural law argument about natural equality and so on. But for Brownson, as a constitutional matter, the Declaration of Independence is the basically summing up a fact, which is the American people, by virtue of customs, religion, common language, the English common law, are in fact one people, separating themselves from the British Empire. And that is the most significant constitutional fact about the Declaration of Independence. It's the Declaration of Independence basically, recognizes, as he says, the fact comes before the right. Once you have established the territorial democracy, which is what he refers to as American sovereignty, the territorial democracy then establishes its relationship it basically determines its government through the Constitution, where the sovereign people, the people of the states united, not an undifferentiated mass, but the people of the states united, establish a fundamental charter of government, which authorizes government for both the general government and also the states. People forget this. The Constitution is limiting the power of the states, authorizing the power of the states, limiting the power of the states, authorizing and limiting in both the case of the states and the federal government. So I think with regard to William, with Garrison and so on, they shared an intense hatred of slavery. There's no question about that. If you look at the historical record, there's none. It's just that what Brownson was concerned about with regard to Garrison, and Garrison, understand, Garrison, sure, he was an abolitionist and that is good, but the fact of the matter is he was also an extremist. Brownson was never an extremist. Garrison, who was the editor of the Liberator, one time he burned the Constitution in front of his house. I think it was 1854. He referred to the Constitution as a covenant with death. It was really off the wall. But Brownson, shared his belief. But Brownson also shared the belief, this critical point. If you basically destroy the Constitution, there is no protection for anybody's rights, the rights of the citizens, but also actually at the end of the day, the newly freed slaves themselves. And so that was his strongest argument. And frankly, I think it's an extremely good argument.
Thank you. And then, Dr. Bartky, at one point in the paper that you were discussing, you contrast Bronson's thoughts on the Constitution with the anti-federalists, specifically arguing that he did not believe that ratification would lead to hypercentralization, or what those anti-federalists called consolidation. So to what extent does Bronson's defense of the document as an expression of territorial democracy align with Publius's account of the extended sphere in Federalist 10? Or perhaps, to put it a little bit more broadly, is Brownson developing his own innovative kind of political theory to explain American institutions, or is he practicing the new science of politics Publius advanced in the Federalist?
I'd say that his understanding the Constitution opposes both the anti-federalist and the federalist understanding. So when you're talking about, for example, the extended sphere, the advantage of the extended sphere that Madison notes is that it'll make it impossible or difficult for those people who have a common interest to know it. And that's a good thing, because as Madison says in the preface to the Notes on the Federal Convention, the radical infirmity of the Articles of Confederation is that it relied on nothing other than the simultaneous compliance of the people with the requisitions of Congress. It was a voluntary ideal, right? And the government could pass laws for the militia call-up and taxes, but they couldn't enforce it because they thought the people voluntarily would do it out of love, right? What's the articles say? We're bound together by a firm league of the F word, friendship, right? That's what it is. Guess what? It doesn't work like this. So when he's talking about, or would take Madison on citizenship is representation. That is a knowing rejection of Aristotelian ideas of participation, right? And for Brownson, you don't need a radical democracy for participation, but it's also rooted in natural law that one participates, including the kid, any sovereign participates in the common good. So the idea of a providential and written constitution, the written constitution is necessary to secure both the human aspects of family, neighborhood, but it's also dangerous. You need the providential constitution to maintain that political theological relationship that I spoke of.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I want to hand it over to Tom McDonough to lead us into lunch.